All right, what's up guys? How's it going? So today we are starting 4.4 Congruent Figures, which I told you guys that we were going to be doing a unit over nothing but triangles. Triangles this, triangles that. So 4.4 Congruent Figures. So we know the definition of congruent means they're basically equal, they're the same thing. So to start off, we're going to read the definition of congruent polygons. So congruent polygons are polygons with corresponding sides and corresponding angles that are all congruent. And so the reason why I've underlined the word corresponding is that's going to be a huge thing when looking at congruent figures. Corresponding, we talked about that in our parallel lines and transversals unit. Corresponding means basically in the same spot. So if we're looking at two congruent figures, then all of the corresponding sides and the corresponding angles have to be congruent. So for instance, we're going to look at these two triangles right here. So right now, just by looking at them, we can look at them and say these could be congruent. But we're going to look at them a little bit deeper and see what's going to happen here. So right now, looking at triangle ABC. So if you look, we have triangle ABC and we have triangle DEF. So I need to look and determine if these are going to be congruent to each other. So right now, I'm going to look at angle A right here. So look at the angle. Do y'all notice it has one arc on it? So right now, looking at this triangle over here, we can see which triangle has one arc on it. So triangle A has one and triangle D has one. So right now, ladies and gentlemen, this means that these two angles are congruent to each other. Okay? So now let's look at B. On B, there's two of them. So on E, there's two of them. So that means B and E are going to be congruent to each other. Okay? And then lastly, C has three arcs on it, and so does F. So that means that these two are going to be congruent to each other. So right now, the way I'm going to write this is I'm going to write triangle ABC is congruent with the little asterisk above it. 2, and look, A goes with D, so I'm going to put triangle D. B goes with E, and C goes with F. So what this shows you is that A corresponds with D, B corresponds with E, and C corresponds with F. Because if you look, A is in the top left, D is in the top left. B is in the bottom, E is in the bottom. C is in the bottom right, F is in the bottom right. So they are corresponding, meaning they're in the same spot. So now let's look at the sides. So looking at side AB, it has one notch on it. Side DE has one notch on it. So ladies and gentlemen, that means that AB and DE are congruent to each other. AB and DE are congruent to each other. Okay? BC has two notches. EF has two notches, so they're congruent to each other. So I want you to look. BC and EF. They're in a row. They're listed correctly. And then lastly, AC has three notches and DF has three notches. So I want you to look. AC and DF. They're listed in the same spot. So what this is showing, ladies and gentlemen, are congruent polygons have corresponding sides. AB's on the left, DE's on the left, BC's on the bottom, EF's on the bottom, and AC and DF are on the top part, or the long side going down. And it's not always going to be in the same way. This one might be shifted, so you have to make sure that the corresponding angles and corresponding sides are all congruent. All right, so now we had two examples that I'm going to talk about when it comes to congruent figures. So again, let's re-talk about congruent polygons. Are polygons with corresponding sides and corresponding angles congruent? Remember, corresponding means they're in the same spot. So that's basically the criteria that has to be put in to help us to figure out if it's congruent or not. So the first thing we're going to look at right here, this states triangle XYZ is congruent to triangle KLM. So since it's telling us that it is congruent, then that tells me the polygons have congruent corresponding sides and they have congruent corresponding angles. So that means all their angles and all their sides are congruent to each other. So right now, I know the measurement of angle Y right here is 67, and the measure of 48 here, or the measure of angle M is going to be 48 here. And so I need to find X. So right here, ladies and gentlemen, this is what I'm trying to find over here. So right now, I know since XYZ is congruent to KLM, I know that Y and L are corresponding, so they're congruent. And I know X and K are corresponding, so I know they're congruent. I know that Z and M are corresponding, so they're congruent. So let's look at this. Y is 67, so Y and L are corresponding, so that means L is 67, correct? So Z right here and M are corresponding, so Z and M are going to be the same thing. So if M is 48, Z is 48. So now I know that inside this, all three angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. So in order for me to find this, I can do 67 plus 48. There's going to be 5, carry the 1, so 115. And then I'm going to subtract that from 180. So 180 minus 115. So 7, we got 5, 7 is 6, so 65. So that means angle X here is going to be 65 degrees. Okay? So then, just to add into it, since X is 65, K would be 65 as well. So since they told me that these are congruent, I can then fill in all that information. It helps me figure that out. Okay? So now let's look over here at this example. So right now, triangle ABC congruent to triangle CDE. And I'll put a question mark here because I want to figure out if we can figure out if these are going to be congruent to each other. Okay? So are ABC and CDE, are those congruent to each other? So again, the corresponding sides have to be congruent and the corresponding angles have to be congruent. So what this means, ladies and gentlemen, is that A has to be congruent to C, B has to be congruent to D, and C has to be congruent to E. So let's go ahead and check that out real quick and see. So right now, looking at angle A, okay? So actually, these need to be switched. So this needs to be E. So right here looking, so right now I said A has to be congruent to E, B has to be congruent to D, and C has to be congruent to C. So let's see if this works out. So A has one notch here, E has one notch here, so those are congruent. Y'all see that? Okay? So B has a 90-degree angle, and D has a 90-degree angle. So those are congruent. And right now, angle C, I had two angle C's right here, correct? So this angle and this angle are actually going to be congruent because they're vertical angles. So C and C are congruent to each other. Y'all see how that works? So all the angles are congruent. Now, all the corresponding sides have to be congruent. So let's check this out. So I'm going to erase these so we can see it. Okay? So AB has to be congruent to ED. Let's check this out. AB is 3. ED is 3. Congruent. Okay? So let's check the next one. So BC and DC have to be congruent. So let's check that out. So BC congruent and DC congruent because they're both 4. So those are congruent. Okay? And now let's check the last one. So AC and EC have to be congruent. So let's check it. AC has a notch, one notch, and EC has one notch. So that means those are congruent. So now all the corresponding angles are congruent and all the corresponding sides are congruent. So ladies and gentlemen, needless to say, ABC and EDC are congruent to each other because corresponding sides are congruent and corresponding angles are congruent.